Today, I thought I'd dig into one of the more traditional, well known, perhaps even classical genres. In fact, now that I think about it, it's probably the most classical genre there is. I think perhaps it might even be the first genre, more or less at least, and that's horror. I guess horror stories were some of the first stories I ever told, getting people all frightened up around the not even campfire or bonfire, the the hearth, or even before that, the cave fire. Horror has to be one of the oldest kinds of stories there is. I guess just like fear is one of the oldest emotions there are. But what really is horror? We have a tendency to confuse horror with a lot of other things. These days, most horror stories in many kind of media are basically action, perhaps action suspense, action thrillers. I'll get into that in a moment. But it's basically here's a monster, fight it, or here's some kind of danger, fight it, or survive it and get away. But really, horror comes down to a few basic elements that, if you can get those elements really right, you have horror that will match up with anything, at least in my opinion, I guess. But what is the core element of horror? Is it danger? No, no. You can have horror without danger, and you can definitely have danger without horror. Is it isolation? No, you can have it both ways. You can have horror without isolation, you can have isolation without horror. They're good tools, but they're not what horror is about. Horror is about not knowing what to do. The characters are at a loss for what to do. They don't have any methods or tools or easy ways out. They don't even have hard ways out, to be honest. They are just in a situation that they know is really, really bad, and they don't know what to do about it. So they panic, they struggle, they try to find a solution. And if a solution ever presents itself, then the horror is basically gone. And you've got just action, or perhaps thriller or suspense. Why am I saying thriller or suspense all the time? Because those two have a weird connection to horror, a weird, timid connection to the horror genre. Basically, if you're very excited about what happens next, it's a thriller. If you're very worried about what happens next, it's suspense. If you have no idea what to do about what happens next, you've got horror. I sometimes think back to the Edgar Allan Poe poem. I have to make a pause between those, or it will sound silly. Poe poem. Um, Nevermore. I think that's the name. It's the one with the raven. The raven says nevermore. And for the longest time, I didn't understand it. And I think a lot of people feel the same. For those who don't know about the poem, it's basically a man who's having some emotional trouble, and a raven comes into his, I think, writing room or something. And basically, all it just does is say nevermore, nevermore. And it scares the man senseless. And what occurred to me is that it's not, there is no real danger to the man. The raven doesn't pose a real danger. It's not like an axe wielding axe wielding maniac. Axe wielding maniac. It's not, well, it is probably supernatural. I don't know how much ravens can speak if they have wider range as parrots. But it's not like a demonic threat or anything. It's not really a threat to him, and that might be why a lot of modern people have a hard time understanding why it was ever considered a horror story. But the Raven is tapping into something deep in the man's thoughts, something that scares him, and he cannot do anything about it. It's the same horror as being reminded of some past failures, some past misdeeds that you feel horrible about. But rather than just brushing it off, it keeps forcing itself on you. Nevermore, nevermore, said the raven, nevermore. And it just forces itself upon you, this horrible feeling. It's not the danger, it's not the isolation, it's the fact that no matter what the man does, he cannot stop this from forcing itself upon him. He cannot stop what the raven represents from getting to him. And that way, horror can be remarkably harmless, really. You can have horror that it's basically just about embarrassment or loss of valuables. You could probably have, I've never seen it, so I don't know if it exists, but you could probably have an entire terrifying horror story, if it's well written, that is all about someone not wanting to lose an old toy, a perfectly normal toy that means a lot to them. Because it's not about what's going to happen once the horror gets you, it's about not being able to stop it. It's about not knowing what to do to prevent something from happening. And what that thing to happen is might not play as big a role as the powerlessness. Horror is basically a story about being powerless. Going back to thriller and suspense, in a thriller, you can be very, very excited about what's going to happen. You can be on the edge of your chair watching your movie or reading your book or whatever, and just wanting to know what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's the solution to the mystery, what is the answer to the riddle, what is the conspiracy hiding, is this guy going to make it out alive, is the villain going to win, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. And you can be terrified that the villain wins or hero gets hurt or something. But the hero has some kind of course of action, even if that action is just fighting, fleeing, or whatever you do in a tight spot. They have a course of action. They know what to do. But if whatever is going to happen is not just something you're interested in, not just something that thrills you, but something that scares you, then it becomes suspense. It becomes suspenseful because you're worried about what happens next. Will the hero be massively hurt? Will the hero be tormented? Will the villain do something even worse than what was expected? You might not even have a clear idea of what's going to happen. It's not necessarily that is this going to happen? It might well be what is going to happen. When the countdown ends, what's the machine going to do? When the criminal gets out, what's he going to do? When your wife finds out the truth, what is she going to do? Questions and worries, and you're on the edge of your seat because you need to know what is going to happen, and all the action leading up to it is basically just teasing you. It's waving the reward around your head, just out of reach, just beyond your grasp. But the real reward of it is when you find out. And once you find out, the suspense is done. And you're back to the action or whatever is going to happen. Same thing with the thriller. Same thing with the thriller. Once you know what's going to happen, then the thrill is resolved. And you're back to just plain action or whatever. But in horror, it's not just about what's going to happen. It's the fact that you don't know what to do about it. You don't know how to prevent things. You don't know how to expect things. You don't know how to act. You could be at a perfectly secure, well lit, fancy dinner, and it could be a horror story because you don't know how to deal with some problem that can have consequences that you really do not want. Those consequences, again, could be minor. It could be the loss of a business deal. It could be social embarrassment. But the horror of it is that things are happening all around you and you do not know what to do. You are struggling, you are panicking, you are fighting against your own ignorance. You cannot control your situation by any means. So you do whatever you can, hoping that something, somehow, will stick. Beyond that core, there are a lot of possibilities with horror. A lot of really effective horror deals with human emotions, deals with the loss of loved ones, deals with the loss of future prospects, being lost in society and losing whatever expectations for the future you had, or even the expectation for the present, losing everything you have. It doesn't have to be losing your life. Losing your life is a very default horror element. But there are plenty more things that can feed into horror. You do not have to be in danger, or I should say the main character, but I'm assuming you know what I mean. You do not have to be in any imminent danger for it to be horror. It could be the classic Stephen King formula, although it usually does have some kind of bodily harm involved. But the classic Stephen King formula usually takes from a situation that has some kind of personal anchor, personal hook in the main character, and making it so weird and so unusual that the main character has no idea how to deal with it. The Pet Cemetery is about things coming back to life that shouldn't and how to deal with it, and when they go out of control, what to do. Yes, there's an imminent danger in it that the things want to hurt people, but that could be anything. That could be a wild animal wanting to hurt people. The horror of it is what is going on and how do you deal with it? What do you do when your loved ones come back to life unnaturally and aren't themselves anymore? What do you do? There is no right answer, so what do you do? In it, at least, the first part, but also the second part. I'm referring to the recent movies. I haven't read the book, but the first part of, and yes, I'll say the whole of it, the whole of it. But in the story, it, the fear, the horror is not just the idea that someone is out to hurt children. You can get that in any kind of story. That could be a basic abuse story, it could be a basic murder mystery. No, the horror comes from the fact that this is a weird clown that is doing things that seem to make no sense, scaring kids and then not finishing the job. It's that the adults around them don't seem to even register what's going on or seem to be willfully ignorant of it. It's that the clown, Pennywise, drives already violent bullies insane. It's that you do not have any idea what's going on. By the end of the story, you do not have a clear idea of what the clown really does to its victims. Yeah, it has the deadlights, lights that hypnotize and seem to drain the spirit from the children it captures. But you don't necessarily know or understand it, or know what to do about it, or know whether there are more of it. I know that there is some cosmic explanation in the book, but you don't really need it, which is probably why it's not in the movies. I don't know, maybe it's also because what I know of it is that it's a kind of insane explanation, but that's perfectly valid to do in a horror story, and at least in a supernatural horror story. But the fear of it, the true terror, the true horror, is that this is so bizarre, so beyond anything that the kids have any kind of idea how to handle, that it just breaks their grasp on reality. Horror is basically knowing that you've gone insane, or that the world has. It's that you have no idea how to deal with this. This falls outside of anything and everything that you have a solution for, be it an easy or a difficult solution. It is far greater horror to be unable to deal with an easy problem than it is to know how to deal with a difficult problem. If a problem is difficult but you know the solution, you can just start going down the path of solution. If a problem, whether it's easy or hard, or if you even know it, if you do not know the solution, you have no idea what to do. And everything you do is basically the wrong move, but you have to do something. And that is where the horror truly lies. You can then add isolation, you can add gore, you can add things being too fast to react to, you can add things being so slow that it's just torture, that nothing seems to happen, and you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. You can add a ton of things, but the key and the core to horror is not knowing what to do.